You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Today on the Open Door, we're going to talk about power. Our welcome and returning guest is Ed Rushman from Anaheim, California. Ed directs the enterprise IT efforts of leading companies and has recently been helping them defend themselves against ransomware attacks. He's a longtime religious educator, and he prepares young people for the Sacrament of Confirmation. Confirmation is the sacrament of courage. So it's no surprise that Ed is also an indefatigable and independent and, yes, irrepressible political reformer. He's running for Congress. Let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, to get us started, there are powers and principalities and earthly powers, and there are lots of different kinds of earthly powers. Ed, gosh golly, he's identified a whole slew of them. Coercion, the power of coercion, power of reward, authority, knowledge, experience, respect, and association. And that's why he's hanging with us, the gang that can't shoot straight. So, Ed, could you help us sort out the various sorts of power? And maybe we'll have some examples. Christopher, for example, is a power on the township board where he is, and among other things, he controls the sewers.
Single-handedly, yeah.
That's amazing.
Well, actually, I don't control the sewers. I have one vote, and it's not a township; it's a village. Get your political distinctions there.
Well, they're about to annex territory.
Oh my goodness! So, well, you may be able to conquer additional sewers.
Ours is the only sewer in the area.
Monopoly. That's the word.
It's our biggest asset.
He calls us not the gang that can't shoot straight, but Christopher likes to refer to us as the Rat Pack.
I should have worn my black suit and tie.
Enough of that cheerful banter, Ed. Get us going.
Okay. So right now, we're just going to think mostly about human power rather than going into some of the theological stuff on God's power because that's really set aside. I will note, though, that in looking at people's comments, especially people that are, opposed to anything having to do with God, they'll simply take God and put him in that same human power category and treat him as if he were simply human, and it's just not the same thing. But we're mostly called to deal with the human side. So there's two definitions I thought are interesting to start off with, and one kind of thing to keep in mind. One is that the idea that power is conferred, human power is conferred by others. You have as much power as people give you. So it isn't a matter of, something that we hold completely on our own. And if there was nobody else, we would have power because there's nobody there. Somebody has to give it. They may not know they're doing it, but that's what it is. And when I took political science a long time ago, one of the first things, I think on the first night, he said, power is the ability to make others do your bidding. And I think if that's the definition of power that we use, it brings a problem right away because it becomes about getting other people to do things. And if you want to demonstrate power, the best way to demonstrate power in the raw, I think, wrong sense is the ability to get other people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Get people to do things even, and we're seeing this in our society, real power is the ability to get people to go against their conscience. So from a political, evil power, if you want to say, point of view, I think that's something to keep in mind. It's certainly something that I cover with my students sometimes. In physics, though, power is force times velocity. It's the rate of transfer of energy over time. It's the rate at which work gets done. And if you look at it that way, the physics definition lends itself to power in the sense of service more than in the sense of ego. And I kind of like the physics one better in some ways. I think it puts us on a better footing. But combined, how fast power is how fast we can affect change through others, how fast we can enlist others to work for change. Or if you want to look at it from another service point of view, how quickly can we deliver grace to others? There's people that if they walk in the room, they're high wattage. There are people that if I hang out with them, I just feel energized afterward. They have personal power. They have, you can call it charisma, but they are giving energy. They're giving strength, could be courage, like you were saying, to me, just by being around them. That's a kind of power. And that's in those types of power that you outlined briefly there. So anyway, let's go forward from there. But I'd like to always keep in mind power in the context of service rather than in the context of conquest, because I think that's where a lot of folks get it wrong. So pretty much all of us know about coercive power. That's one of the ones. It's just the ability to punish. I don't think it's terribly interesting. We've all seen it. It's all over through history. It's through, and one of the things we talk about in the classes with my students sometimes is the way that, there'll be somebody that's 16, 17 years old, they get a job in fast food, and for whatever reason, they get made a lead. And the next thing you know, they're like Stalin or something. And really it goes to their head. And enough of them have this experience or have seen it. Even at school, somebody that gets some little student body position or something, and they kind of go crazy. So they can all identify with that. And I think that's good that they have seen it and that they don't like it. I haven't had anybody yet to defend it and said, no, I have that power. It's wonderful. So that's something. And it can, of course, go everything from, fear of losing the person's job in coercive power, with a boss that uses that, their bonus, and in other places, it can be their life. Right now, we just saw a thing with doxing on the internet, and that is a kind of coercive power. And a community can hold that power, where a lot of individuals each have really no significant amount of power, but you mass them together, and then they have power. So sometimes we think of power as individuals, but it's power of a community. And I almost hate using that word for that kind of activity. But that's there. If you go back to where humans have come from, we are all afraid of being exiled from our tribe. just some of us more than others. I think of the work of Solomon Asch, who did the conformity experiment. He rigged it so that the test subject was one person in a room full of people. They were asked a question about the length of some lines by comparison, and the lines are these different lengths compared to a reference line, when it was A, B, and C, different lengths. And they were obviously different, except one was the same. And he'd asked this group, well, which one, A, B, or C, is the same length as the other one? Everybody in the room but the subject, and the subject thought everybody was a subject, but everybody in the room except that subject was going to give the wrong answer. That was the design of the experiment. So they all say it was a line that was line C, which was far longer than the original. And the one person that was the actual test subject would almost invariably agree with the wrong answer. They couldn't go against the crowd. And that's a kind of coercive power, because it isn't that there's a defined punishment. It's just that fear. If everybody else says this, I don't want to be out of the tribe. And I just think that's one of the most important experiments. I wish they'd teach that to everybody in school. It's a really, really good one. And I'm going to go back to a few psychologists for some of these, because people have experimented on this stuff. So there's that. And most of us have experienced coercive power, certainly with some of the things that have been happening in the government these last few years, and just the sheer mass disapproval for certain behaviors. And whether they're right or wrong, just because it's coercive power doesn't make it wrong. There are times you have to do it, I guess. But anyway, and then the other flip side of that is reward. And I don't really see a lot of difference between those two. The ability to reward is not very far different from the ability to punish. And of course, you can't help but think of Skinner and behavioral modification. The idea that you can, if you're a really strict behaviorist, then you think, well, everything is about giving the right rewards and punishments, and then we can shape society into whatever we want. So that's interesting. The authoritative power, I've seen it called a legitimate title power, formal power. It's just that somebody has been elected or appointed or in some way put in a position of responsibility. And at some point here, we'll probably think about some things with church. You have a pope, you have bishops, there's always structure in human society. And so that's strictly coming out of that. And that is a really good example of power being given, and that both in the process of election or selection, but also because everybody agrees that once that's been done, we will follow. So those are three that I think get talked about the most. The next one's not so much, but I thought it might be nice to just anybody have any reflections on any of those, some experience, anything you want to share.
May I interject something?
Mm-hmm.
I have been listening to you carefully, but to be honest, I don't know which one is the point. What do you want to talk about power? To whom? Why? If I'm listening to you, if any of my students say, hey, what is the point? Power? Talk about love. Why power?
I think
how would you respond to that?
Yes. So the thing is that power is a reality, and every reality of life, I think, is worth examining. It's one that's been behind an awful lot of things in the world. And there's a quote that I don't have coming to mind right now, but essentially it's that if you won't think about power, if you won't address power, then power will simply take over. It will do its thing. It will act upon you. And you may not even be aware of it if you don't examine it. So I think it's my nature to examine everything in life. And power has played such a huge role in human affairs. There's almost nothing that isn't there. And, we can think about it in political terms. But if you took one of the things I do in my work a lot of times is work out scope. What's the scope of the thing we're working with here? Power is involved individually in even power over ourselves. There's plenty of that in philosophy. But there's power in the family. In parenting, the way that we chose to raise our children and with regard to power was a lot based on my reflections, and in the church and in the small community, even among the four of us.
Let me talk about politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to distinguish in order to understand. One thing is the family, another thing is the political system. The power that exercises someone who has gone through the contract, to use a general term in modernity, is a consented power.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I've been conferred the power to exercise on behalf of the general welfare.
That's right.
Now, then the population accepted, at least implicitly, that power. And that is coercive power, because that power is exercised through what? The rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone, at least in modern time, live under this presupposition, if you will.
Okay.
Now, another thing is the power that someone have in the family. In other words, you don't get together your family and decide who is going to hold power.
Right.
So right there, you have to make a distinction in order to understand. I'm not saying that family doesn't belong to political body as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a different type of, at least the origin of power. Now, in political terms also, generally speaking, perhaps you may have a different view, but generally, constitutional lawyers or theoreticians distinguish what they call just mere power or crude power from power comes from authority, the authority of the people who have given the consent.
Mm-hmm.
But always is coercive. It's not
Mm-hmm.
a moral power. In other words, you don't pay taxes, well, somebody else is going to come after you.
Right.
Now, even though you may not like it, but that's what happened. So let's talk about that political power. How then we can distinguish that power from reward, or its power also give reward and authority and all these notes that you so well you expressed so well previously.
So the first thing about it, and it's unique to some constitutions compared to others, is that it's like goes back to scope. What's the scope of the power? If somebody rules by the consent of the governed, and of course, is that one person ruling or a body ruling, that kind of thing. If it's by the consent of the governed will have in some way expressed a scope of that authority. Now, in the case of, if we go back in history to somebody like, the dictators of Rome, if you look at Cincinnatus as, the example of, supposedly a better side, that people say there is no scope. Do whatever you have to do. You're dictator, just rule us, and there's no limits. And that may not be completely accurate historically, but it's certainly a very broad scope versus the Constitution, which says, here's a list of 10 things right off the bat that the government can't do. So we're putting some boundaries on here. You can't just go off and start killing people without any due process, for instance. That's not constitutional. That's it. So there's boundaries on it, even on the coercive power, and that's what the courts, are there for, is to help not enforce in the sense of an army, but through their decisions. There's really, I suppose, nothing that says you can't ignore a Supreme Court decision. There'd be some fallout down the line. But maybe that's one of the first things to think about, is that there's a scope to it. And the second thing is, although there's coercive power, there is a certain amount of power that the people have to push back. you could have a law that's unjust and everybody could simply refuse to obey it. The law is not completely coercive. There is a certain amount of agreement, but there will always be a certain small number of people that just don't accept it and want to do something different. And for them, they may feel the coercion. Without government and law, though, a tribe could still enforce an unwritten law. I'm thinking about some of the ancient societies where there was no really written law. My Egyptian history is a little bit lacking in some ways, but as I remember, in Egypt under the Pharaoh was actually the law. And they didn't have the concept of written laws as the Romans did and as we do. So Pharaoh would actually decide things as he or she felt like deciding. It was not always predictable. And that actually having a written law became more of a protection for people, more so than coercion. Does that make sense?
It's a long issue. Perhaps we need to make a distinction when this limited to power began. And the limited to power began in 1789.
Yes.
In other words, before that, yes, there may have been some constitution, but the constitution never limited power. In other words, that we owe to modernity. In other words, the limitation by a rule of law, which can balance the power, different, what we call branches, began in the late 1800s. So that's key. Now, doesn't mean that the people in ancient Rome or in Greece, you can read Aristotle, they have a constitution. Many of them have a constitution, a very well-refined constitution. But what lacked those constitutions was what we call balance of power.
That's right.
And so that is when you read what we may call the environment of historical ages, you can see how people get more conscious of how some exercise power over others. So there's a long history. So my only point was that if we talk about power today in a political setting, there is no other way of talking about that other than coercive power in political sense. Now, there also are moral power, persuasive way of argumentation, all that. But in political term is precisely that. You can read any handbook in constitutional law. The distinction is very clear between authority and power.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the other thing is that even in those protections, like the amendments,
right.
The problem is that through interpretation in the courts, they can be turned around, and what was a protection from the government actually can become a source of abuse.
But yet still, even if this is decision made by the Supreme Court is abusive, has authority.
Yes.
The authority is there given by the Constitution. Now, the means that these people use in order to exercise that authority may be debatable or controversial. But I think that's key. Unless we find another system better than this one. And I don't think there is a better one.
Yeah, what did somebody say?
I may be wrong, and so.
Well, somebody said, what, this is a terrible system, but it's the best one out there. I think that when we try, maybe it goes a little bit to utopia, that, people are trying to find some perfect system and they're willing to do an awful lot of awful things sometimes to put it in place, the one that they think is good. But in the end, it's human beings, and there's almost 8 billion people with free will running around in the world. And I just don't see any system that's ever going to prevent abuse in a lasting way. But this is the system that we have, and I agree with you. I think this is really the best that we have, at least the best we've come up with so far. Given the realities of what humans are, at least in my view, we have to work with this one. But I think, again, it's important to recognize the advantages and the flaws, and never come to think that something is the end, that this is the perfect thing for running society. We've now found something that will bring complete world peace and everything will be lovely.
Yes.
I think it was probably, I should probably credit it to Sefrelli, that said that, quote in Jesus of Nazareth, that people must change before nations do. And as long as the human heart is what it is, this is what we've got.
I'm looking, Mario and Ed, I'm looking at Christopher Zander, and
yes,
he looks like he's got some ideas he wants to share with us.
I don't know if I have many ideas to share. I do have a question as to when you're talking about power, I guess you could write, what you've written is what we call de potestate, concerning power. Power is, the word power, I mean, it seems like an analogical category. What I mean by that is that it doesn't have the same meaning. Exactly. They're related meanings, but not the same meaning. Mm-hmm. We can speak of, when you look at the Latin word potestas, which is rooted in the word potest, possum potest, mm-hmm. to be, he is able, right?
Yes.
It's an ability. We can speak of the powers of the intellect. We can speak of the powers of the soul, the powers of the body. How do you see what is the relationship you see between that use of power and the kind of, seems like what you're talking about is power, interrelational power, mm-hmm. power between individuals, between groups and the like. How do you see, how do these two categories fit together?
Well, the power that we have over ourselves, to the degree we have power over ourselves, because some people just, obviously, self-control is not a strong point. That's the balance, as I see it in society, is that if each individual is concerned about power over their own passions, power over themselves, self-control, and essentially our power over ourselves is the best protection for others. So maybe that's, like I said, people must change before nations do. It's the individual has to have power over themselves. There's things that I will, I was thinking about the other day was that, think about the last time that you thought, that's not fair. Just that phrase. If it just ran through your head, that's not fair. Were you looking at somebody else's behavior or your own behavior? Because power over yourself is when you can say, that's not fair, over your own behavior, over your own thoughts, over, what's the word, von Hildebrand, sanction, the power of sanction, can I look at my own thoughts that I'm thinking about something? I'm thinking about Jim and I'm thinking, oh, Jim, why aren't you doing this? And then do I say to myself, well, that's not fair. That's power over the self. Because I'm sanctioning, I'm saying, I am, in a sense, not in the worst sense, but judging and saying my thoughts in this regard are not fair. I'm not being just in my thoughts. Or is it a matter of looking at others and saying, well, I don't think they're fair. And I think you find a lot in society right now, people are far more concerned with actions that are not fair, that are external to them, than internal. I'm probably coming at that a little bit sideways. But if you're looking to me, when you're looking at power over the self-control and everything, that's the way that you protect society from yourself. So it's still, I think that's the interface between power over the self and power over others, or shared power or subject power, is the point at which my self-control, my mastery of myself, is my best defense on behalf of society. Does that make sense a little bit, Christopher?
Yeah, I guess I was just, I don't know if it's actually apropos to what we're discussing, but I'm thinking not simply power over oneself, but the power I have in myself.
Yes.
What I mean,
the potentiality, you mean? Yeah.
Well, not necessarily potentiality. Like if I know geometry, the active knowledge of geometry is a power that I have. My intellect is a power. First of all, my intellect is a power that I possess. And then I also possess, when I develop the intellect in certain fashion, such as geometrical knowledge, I have a developed power. And so, in other words, I can say I am able to do geometry. And so the whole being able seems to be at the essence, right?
Yes.
Right.
Okay, and that goes back to the idea that I'd mentioned earlier, that it's that classic thing. Are we inward focused or are we outward focused? Mm-hmm. If you have the potentiality, if you have the power of sounds like I'd like to see a superhero like this. The power of geometry. Oh, actually, that was done. That was in the second Jumanji movie. If you haven't seen it, one of the characters has the power of geometry. Mm-hmm. So there you go. You should see Jumanji too. Right. Okay, so the point is, and actually, I'm going to use that further. So in that movie, there are a group of people that are trying to get out of a bad situation, and they have different powers, and one of them has the power of geometry. And they come up to a challenge, and the only way for the group to survive is for that character to use his power of geometry. They're actually crossing a series of moving bridges and stuff, and there's a lot of triangles and stuff like that involved, and angles, and he has to figure all this stuff out. Because he has the power of geometry, he can do this. He can lead them. So he takes over leadership of the whole group for a short time through his power of geometry. So it's, do we take the power that we have and put it at the service of everyone, at the service of others, or do we simply revel in it and use it for our own enjoyment or for our own gain or whatever? So it's all about that classic thing of, am I focused inward and just thinking about myself, or am I putting my powers at the disposal of the community? Is that a little bit more what you were thinking, Christopher?
Well, not so much. I mean, I guess I was just trying to get a sense of what we mean by power.
And then there's so many meanings.
Yeah, I mean, and
that's a whole nother dimension.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about the powers, or like the power to walk, I have a relative who was born with spinal bifida and can't walk. Right, he doesn't have the power to do that. Mm-hmm. And I can possess the power to do geometry, but I possess it. I'm not simply for others. I possess it actually primarily and first for myself, because it's a perfection of self, right? And then it can be put in the service of others. So I could contemplate geometry, and it is good simply to do so. But it seems, I guess, the essence is, if we're trying to look at what power is, it's an ability. It's that by which we can say I'm able. Different from potency, right? I might have the potency to be a geometer, but I never study geometry, so that never comes to be. I have a human capacity. I might have the potency. I might be a geometer. I mean, I'm not thinking about geometry. I'm thinking about power, for instance. And so I have the potency there to do geometry. And then I have the actual power when I'm exercising it. And that is, so I think that's, and so that power, the ability to say I'm able, extends to all kinds of power, I would think. I'm able to get you to pay your taxes, for instance. So that would be what the government would say, right?
Yeah, the body politic has power, and it is analogous to the personal power. At the same time, there are, it's funny. I was thinking the other day, actually, in a conversation with somebody about how the power, for instance, of the executive branch grows by challenges that are then decided by courts. So a president tries to do something, somebody challenges it, and the court says, no, they can do that. Well, then they just increase their power. And now they will continue to exercise that until it gets to a point that somebody challenges them and the court says, no, you can't do that. And then that becomes the check on that power. Kind of like what Mario was saying earlier, the balance of these powers, the balances of the branches and everything. Along with what you're saying, Christopher, what's interesting is you say that you could have a potentiality. I mean, I'm going to put this in different terms, but if you don't develop it, it isn't a power, because you can't. It doesn't mean it's an ability because you didn't exercise it. I mean, I may be able to run a 6-minute mile, but I have not yet achieve that because I haven't developed it to that point. I may be mistaken. I may not have that ability. I won't know until I test it, just like I was saying with the court. And then nature will confirm or deny that I have that ability. But I was thinking of a seed. There's a seed planted in the ground, and there's no guarantee that that seed will sprout. So it has the potential to become the acorn, planted in the ground, has the ability to become an oak tree. But there's no guarantee that it will. It's going to need certain things in nature. It's going to need certain care. And there's perhaps something that we call random because we don't understand it. But it may or may not actually bloom or grow and become the thing that it has the potential for. So there could be a great geometer out there someplace, potentially, who never develops it. That's one of the reasons why with our children, I expose them to a lot of different things. And in case you didn't remember, we have 6, 3 girls, 3 boys. I just exposed them to everything. I mean, I made sure, one of the funny things was I made sure that I had a piano in the house. I actually got my cousin's piano and rebuilt it, so it didn't cost much. And just kept it in the house and taught them how to do scales and all the different keys and a few other things. And then that's about all I really taught them. And some of them became musicians and some didn't because they chose. Lloyd Alexander in his Prydain Chronicles, there's, the typical thing that you put 3 things before the child, the book, the sword, and I forgot what the third one is, and see which one the infant reaches out for. One of my granddaughters is not even a year old. They actually did this accidentally. She had things on the table and picked up the one thing, and I forgot what it was now. And they were like, oh, it's just like that. So often the parenting side, I always think of, giving them the opportunity to choose, the opportunity to develop. But in other areas, you're right. It may never get developed. But then once we have that power, and as you said, it's first, it has to be within ourselves. Because until you have it within yourself, and until you have reveled in geometry, how can you share it with anybody else? How can you put it at service if you haven't developed it fully or largely within yourself first and enjoyed it or used it well or something, and then you can share it with others? You have to become a master before you can take on an apprentice. You can't teach somebody else carpentry until you've mastered carpentry to some degree. Is that kind of am I more on target with your thinking?
Yeah.
I'm always looking at this as in terms of, are we doing something for ourselves or are we doing it for the community? But doing it for the community does not preclude doing it for the self. The self is a requirement before it can move to service of the community.
Where would you place the power of custom? I'm thinking we were talking about government before. And one thing I do disagree with, that 1789 was the foundation of limited government. I think limited government existed prior, not in a written constitution, but in terms of custom.
Yes.
In the Middle Ages, you had customary law, which actually was fairly, even lords would not transgress customary law too often.
The rights of serfs, they could appeal to their lord, I believe. And I think there were cases in Europe in the Middle Ages where serfs actually successfully petitioned against their lord.
Right. Yeah. Custom, and that's one of the reasons why lords towards the 16th century wanted to get rid of customary law. They wanted written law. Written law is much easier to manipulate.
Yeah.
And two, I would think, this is just a side note on the customary thing. It seems to me that all law ultimately becomes customary. We have a written constitution in the United States, but the custom of interpreting it has changed over the past 250 years. Even something like judicial review, that's not found in the Constitution.
Right.
But it became the custom of how to interpret it. So where would you stick custom in your categories?
I don't know. Custom almost feels like it's a natural function of society. As soon as you get a few people together, you're going to fall into certain patterns that are beneficial. Maybe if I think of it from an evolutionary, not in only the Darwinian sense, but in a more general term, it's pretty natural that custom will, in a sense, evolve. out of a group of people. You find what works, what doesn't work, what's painful, what's pleasurable. And it seems as natural as, in a way, societies are societies are the individual writ large. It's the sum, it's the network effect, if you will, of the group of people. So custom is really what works. And the fact is that we have custom just for ourselves. There are certain things I do a certain way. I remember when I was young and first started working and living on my own and everything, this is going to sound funny, but my custom was that anything related to cars went in my right pocket and keys for houses and work and went in my left pocket. I had them on two separate key rings. I suspect that's not normal. But that became my custom. And if I had been in a position to continue doing that, and I got married, it's possible that my wife would have picked that up. I mean, she didn't, but, and if I had children, they might all end up doing that. And then somebody else could look at it and say, you know what, that kind of makes sense to me. And then it becomes custom at a social level. But going back to the thing with geometry, it has to start with me first. So maybe in a society, custom begins with an individual that gets an idea and doesn't necessarily talk about it always, but may simply practice it. It's a custom that we don't talk about much anymore, but my daughters and I were just talking about this, is hospitality. That's a custom that most societies have. I think we're losing it in modern times. But we just had we had major water damage in our house and had to get some repair work done. Every worker that comes into the house is going to be offered food and drink. And I tell them, they're working on the one back area where there's a little kitchenette thing. And I said, there's some juice back there and some cups, feel free. If you want something to drink, enjoy. I didn't really serve them. It's not a big formal thing, but that's a custom. That's a human custom. I wonder if aliens, came to visit us, if they would not have the custom of hospitality and find it strange. But if you go to very densely populated places in the world, the custom of hospitality is lacking. I mean, it seems to me that we've kind of lost that sense. A lot of that natural courtesy and welcoming and serving others, it's like, well, why would I serve somebody else? I'm not their slave. So, I think it still comes from an individual, but that origin, of course, is lost by the time we recognize it as custom. The origins are lost. We can attempt to recreate it and say, here's why it made sense to have hospitality. But really, we're recreating because we don't know. No one's observed the birth. I don't think. Has anybody ever observed the birth of a custom?
I haven't personally.
But I mean, even in recorded, there's a phenomenal amount of brain power and experience here.
Like standing up for the Hallelujah chorus in Handel's Messiah. I mean, that started with a king of England.
Really?
Yeah, and yeah, I think great men sometimes, or the custom of not wearing hats, right? We used to wear hats all the time. And well, that dates back to John F. Kennedy, I understand. So we began to lose the custom of wearing hats because a president didn't wear hats in public.
Oh, that's funny you'd say that, because I remember there was something about men wearing undershirts, and Clark Gable supposedly killed that because he didn't wear one in a movie and the sales dropped through the floor. Can you look that one up? I remember that.
So yeah, I guess you do witness them sometimes.
Oh, that's interesting.
But not like something like a handshake. I mean, the handshake is time immemorial. Yeah.
That's fascinating. When you say handshake, of course, it made me think of hakas. I can do it with the Maori.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the opportunity to see one performed. And it was an interesting thing because for me, the custom has great significance and depth. And in a sense, it's a little bit terrifying. Not because the faces only, but the whole situation, the tension in not just a one-sided one, but the proper thing with the thing in the middle and the whole bit. But what was interesting was the number of people that were there a lot of them were tourists, And when it was being performed, they laughed.
Hmm.
And I was horrified. I thought, how can you laugh at this? I mean, and I understand, it just they don't know the depth of it. But it's a custom that has, phenomenally old roots. And I wonder who started that. Who came up with the idea, and how many times did it just go wrong?
Well, folks, I know that Sebastian Mahfoud started this here open door custom that we have, and looking out at you, I can tell that you have a secret desire to talk about love, truth, metaphysics, and Wittgenstein. However, that desire is in the hands of, at least insofar as I can contribute to realizing that desire, it's in the hands of 8 not so tiny reindeers on my roof. You will hear sounds that come from the roofers, but if I might, Mario got us started by talking about love, and why not talk about love rather than power? And Mario perhaps can expand on the notion that love has the power to make the world go round. Love has the power to make the world go round. And that brings us to truth. We have Gandhi, and we talk about Gandhi and non-violence, but Gandhi himself always wanted to speak in terms of positive terms. And a term that he oftentimes used was satyagraha, the power of truth, satyagraha, love, truth, metaphysics. Well, we've been talking about, Ned, you've been talking about potential. Well, at a fundamental level of metaphysics, anything that has potential, anything that is in potency, has to have that potency activated by something outside of itself, or at least by something within itself that's quite distinct from that particular potency. So when we talk about the activization of potency, we're talking about the bringing to bear on that potency of some sort of power. So there's that. And that's metaphysics. And now comes Wittgenstein. Has anybody seen a custom start? Well, I think somebody in the Wittgensteinian tradition would say, strictly speaking, no, and nobody has ever seen a language begin, because language isn't a private activity. Language isn't private. Oh, I'm going to start a language. There's no.
Oh.
So Wittgenstein is always talking about forms of life, and it's forms of life, whole forms of life, that bring about languages, that bring about customs. And I think that if I could put in a pitch for philosophy, all of the things that we've been talking about really connect with enduring philosophical themes. Another pitch for philosophy is wherever you start, it's not long before you are doing philosophy.
Yep.
And I would imitate Ed and say, does that make sense? But I'm afraid the answer will be no, it doesn't make sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, because philosophy is looking at life. And this is nothing that we talk about here, nothing that anybody can ever talk about is separate from life. Just very briefly, though, something that you said really, really hit me. We've really been talking about everything from a human perspective, and that power is something that has to be, pardon me, power is something that has to be given. So if we're going to talk about the power of love, that means that we look at love and say, I will give you power over me. And to love is to give yourself to that power and say, I acknowledge the power of love. I embrace it. I will live according to it. to the degree that those in power do so by the consent of the governed, okay, so if we choose to be governed by power, it is with our consent that we say to love, yes, I will let you be powerful over me. If it comes down to my will or yours, I will take the power of love and accept that as power over me rather than my own. And the same thing with truth. I would bet that everybody on here and anybody listening, at some point, I hope, has found themselves overpowered by truth. That we've held to something for a long time and believed it, or practiced something for a long time, or done something for a long time, and one day realized that it was opposed to truth, and we said, I can't deny this any longer. The truth has to win. I love the truth. I give it power over me, and I have to change my way of thinking because I'm overpowered by the truth. Does that make sense? So my own power, I willingly let it be limited by love, by truth, and for me, to some degree, by beauty. There are some things where beauty overpowers me. And I love to talk more than just about anybody. And there are times that something is so beautiful that it defies speech. And I just can't even talk about it. And I've tried, in classes and other places. It's like, sometimes you just have to see it. That's the reason why I use movie clips and quotes and things a lot in my classes. Because I say, I can't explain this. I can't give you my feeling. I can't connect you up to me and transfer from my heart to yours. So I'm just going to show you what I found beautiful and hope that it provokes the same response in you.
Well, it's time for Mario to rejoin us.
Good.
What do you say, sir?
I really don't know. There are too many things and all over the place. When you say that you prefer to give or to show a movie to your students because they may react the same way you do, what made you believe that they wouldn't react to what you are saying and instead they would react to what the movie is showing? What would be the difference between you and the movie?
So in a sense, this is going to be...
Let me, and just to add something to that. That is a very current idea. Imagine you are Aristotle. Mm-hmm. You're walking around. Or you are Socrates. Or you are Aquinas. So you didn't have movies. So you have to persuade people. How then you respond to that? Why then the movie or any other technological tools, if you will?
And the movie for me is just another way of storytelling. But for the ancients, of course, they had mythology, they had the heroic stories. So it's really no different to me. I could tell, I did this last night, actually. I spent the whole evening telling them stories.
There is a difference because you said, I would show that so they react in the same way that I react to that movie. So it seems to me that you are implying that the attraction of the movie will be deeper than the way that you present the whatever issue is. And now you say, well, that is what is happening today. The ancient may not have this tool, but I don't see any difference between the heart of an ancient person and ours.
Right, I agree.
Are the same, aren't we?
Yes, and it isn't that I expect them to get the same thing out of it that I do, but there is the potential that they will get something, because I think that when something strikes us as beautiful or as truth, I think that somebody else may take it differently. They're going to, each one interprets according to their own background and their own experience. But there are things that are moving, whether they're an old myth or whether they're in a movie now. I don't show them the whole movie. I just show them scenes, because if I show them the whole movie, that's too much. But if I see something deep, if I see something beautiful in it, they may not see the same thing, But I trust that many of them will see something that moves them according to who they are. And that's good enough for me. My love for free will is huge. And I never, ever forget that. So each one will take it in their own way, but there are things out there that are essentially sand. There's plenty of entertainment out there that's really, to me, I see very little depth in it. I don't see anything in any of the criticism of it in the sense of reviews or anything that indicates any depth. It doesn't appeal to me. I'm not going to use those because why would I? Now, somebody may find some depth and I'm blind to it. And I accept that. That's part of that whole individuality. But if I find something that moves me deeply, it has a better chance of moving someone else. And it's between them and God how it moves them. And the same thing for myths. In myths, different people take different myths different ways. Even among the ancient, if you brought something out, one person will see it, well, the Trojan War. One person looks at it as the destructive effects of anger. I mean, it starts with anger. And somebody else will look at it as a matter of honor, and somebody else will look at it in some other way. They'll all focus on different parts of a story according to who they are. But what we can all agree on, I think, is that something like the Trojan War has some depth and has things to tell us and things for us to reflect on as people. Does that make sense?
We've got 5 minutes left, and all of us here are friends of the American Solidarity Party. And how's the campaign going?
I'm certainly pulling out the stops this time. I've got messages going out to more than 100,000 people. And the response rates have been interesting. This is a hard, abrupt turn here, Jim, but I will just let you know what I learned because I think it's fascinating. I found that the people most likely to open my mails and actually do something with them are libertarians. And not because I'm libertarian, because I'm not, I don't agree with them on everything, but they seem to be the most open to actually researching candidates by a huge margin. 38% would actually open it up, pay attention and act and take action on it. Republicans were second at 17%. Independents were the most closed-minded of all, that less than 1% would actually research a candidate at all. Most of them, 99%, just ignore it and vote partisan. And they're reliably partisan. This is the irony of life. 2/3 of independents in our district will vote Democrat, 1/3 will vote Republican every single time.
To what do you attribute that the people who are doing most research are libertarian?
I'm not really sure, except maybe it's because they feel the most frustrated because they can't get anywhere. They're 1% in our district. So they kind of feel like they don't have any representation. So I think they're they actively want something and they're not finding it. So they're still willing to look. Maybe they're just diehard people that are trying to find a solution. They can be pretty aggravating to talk with sometimes because of the lack. I see a lack of community, and yet I can't argue with the stats. The fact is, maybe they're just so unrepresented that they're just willing to. They're really willing to take anybody that is willing to actually talk with them and listen to them, and that shares even some of their ideas.
That really is a fascinating statistic. The party's last presidential candidate, Brian Carroll, when he ran for Congress, defeated the Libertarian in his congressional district. And that's fascinating too. There are all kinds of political puzzles, and political scientists claim to solve the puzzles, and fortunately they don't.
Well, I think the ASP has the advantage, though, that it does have cross-party, cross-philosophy appeal. And I do, too, in this district. One of my current thing, which I'll do very quickly, my current thing is to get Republicans to stop voting Republican here, because they always lose 70 to 30%. Every single election since 1998, they cannot possibly win, and yet they persist in voting for Republican candidates. And so my pitch for Republicans has been, vote for me because your candidate can't win anyway. So vote for me, and at least you have some chance because I have cross philosophy appeal. You know, there are some Democrats that support me.
What about age?
I haven't found a good correlation on age at all. I'm just on the process right now of doing an experiment with young people 18 to 22. So next time we can talk about that or something, or if I can send it to you. I'm just looking to see what their response rate is. I hope it's better, but I'm trying to find the right kind of message, and that's what I'm working on after I get off this call.
Thank you.
The end of the show. We're at the end of the show, and we always do the gospel for the day. But there's so much racket that I'm only going to do part of the gospel for today.
It's not too bad, Jim.
Oh, all right. Then I'll do the whole gospel for today. And what we can keep in mind is that there's all sorts of interruptions in our everyday life. So here they are, once again, interrupting us. That very day, the first day of the week, 2 of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looked downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. How our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described. But him they did not see. How slow of heart to believe, all foolish you are. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And it happened that while he was with them at table, he took bread and blessing, broke it and gave it to them. With that, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We shall be meeting again, and next time will be in 2 weeks, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.